Summer 1943, 3 German admirals and 40 generals arrived at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where the United States Army assigned each of them a private bungalow with a garden, gave them orderlies and freedom to walk the grounds, treated enemy commanders who had fought to destroy America with more luxury than most Mississippi families enjoyed during wartime rationing. The absurdity of defeated Nazi officers tending flower beds in the Deep South, while their armies collapsed in Europe, revealing everything strange and contradictory about how the Geneva Convention worked in practice. How military rank transcended national loyalty. How America's determination to follow international law created situations where Rommel's replacement lived better in captivity than many American soldiers fighting overseas. The whole arrangement making perfect legal sense, while feeling morally outrageous to anyone who stopped to think about it. I first heard about the generals at Camp Shelby from a Mississippi veteran named Thomas Baker, whose father had been assigned guard duty there in 1944. Told me how surreal it felt watching enemy admirals pruning roses and generals discussing philosophy, while American boys his age were dying on beaches in Normandy. The whole arrangement seeming like elaborate joke, except it was deadly serious policy based on Geneva Convention requirements that officers be treated according to their rank, regardless of which side they fought for. Thomas said his father kept letters describing the disconnect between what the newspapers reported about brutal enemy forces and what he witnessed daily, refined German officers reading books and playing chess and complaining about Mississippi heat. Men who had commanded armies against Allied forces, now concerned primarily with whether their gardens received enough water and whether the camp library had acquired the latest German literature. Camp Shelby near Hattiesburg in southern Mississippi had been established in 1917 and expanded massively for World War II, becoming second largest training base in America after Fort Benning, Georgia, its location in the pine woods and mild climate making it ideal for preparing divisions before they shipped overseas to fight in every theater of the war. The Japanese-American 432nd Regimental Combat Team trained there despite facing discrimination at home, proved their loyalty through extraordinary courage in Europe while their families remained in internment camps. The irony of German prisoners receiving better treatment than American citizens of Japanese descent, too obvious to miss, but rarely discussed by authorities, who preferred not acknowledging such contradictions that expose the racial dimensions of how America applied its democratic values. The decision to send high-ranking German officers to Mississippi rather than to camps in colder northern states reflected practical considerations about the Geneva Convention and American geography. Article 21 specified that officers above captain rank were entitled to orderlies and private quarters, that generals should have living conditions approximating those of equivalent American rank, which meant individual housing with adequate space for dignity and comfort, rather than crowded barracks where enlisted men lived. Camp Clinton near Jackson, Mississippi also received generals, the 2 Mississippi camps together, housing virtually all captured German flag officers because the warm climate meant cheaper construction costs, and the rural isolation minimized security concerns about high-value prisoners who might possess intelligence worth protecting or escaping to deliver to remaining German forces. Then something unexpected happened that nobody in Mississippi had anticipated when Camp Shelby was selected for this purpose. On August 8, 1943, the first generals arrived by train from processing centers on the East Coast, 43 enemy officers in tailored uniforms, despite being prisoners, their bearing and discipline immediately impressing even guards who hated what they represented. The sight of so much military brass in one place, creating strange atmosphere, where American enlisted men found themselves saluting enemy generals, according to regulations that required respecting rank regardless of nationality. Leading them was General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel as commander of all Axis forces in North Africa, the man responsible for final doomed defense that ended with 267,000 Germans and Italians surrendering in Tunisia in May 1943, one of the largest capitulations in military history, and the event that filled American camps with veterans of the legendary Afrika Korps. Von Arnim was 54 years old, Prussian military aristocrat from a family that had produced generals for centuries, a professional soldier who fought because duty demanded it rather than because he believed Nazi ideology. His capture, representing the collapse of German ambitions in North Africa and the opening of Europe's soft underbelly to Allied invasion. American intelligence officers who interrogated him found a man more concerned with military history and proper procedure than with politics, someone who saw himself as soldier first and German second, the mindset common among Wehrmacht officers who distinguished themselves from SS fanatics, even though that distinction often meant little to victims of German aggression who were killed just as dead by professional soldiers as by ideological zealots. The bungalows prepared for the generals were simple wooden structures but far more comfortable than barracks housing regular enlisted prisoners, each one containing a bed and desk and chairs and windows with screens against Mississippi mosquitoes. A small porch where officers could sit in evening, watching the sunset over pine forests that reminded some of German countryside they had left behind when war called them to North African deserts. Guards helped prisoners plant gardens in front of their quarters, providing seeds for vegetables and flowers purchased with prisoner wages or donated by local nurseries who saw opportunity for goodwill gestures that might benefit their businesses. The sight of enemy generals kneeling in dirt to tend tomatoes and zinnias becoming routine enough that locals driving past the camp barely noticed anymore. The normalization of absurdity being how humans cope with situations too strange to process fully without questioning fundamental assumptions about how the world should work. You won't believe how comfortable their lives became within weeks of arriving at Camp Shelby. Today, welcome to this channel, and to an authentic World War II story in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting. So, sit down and grab a cup of coffee. Von Arnim received a car and driver for trips into Hattiesburg 15 miles north, ate at restaurants that welcomed him despite knowing he was enemy general, some accounts suggesting he attended movies at the only air-conditioned theater in town where he sat among Mississippi families watching Hollywood films while his former soldiers fought desperate rearguard actions in Italy against the very armies that had defeated him in Tunisia. The stories might have been exaggerated by locals who enjoyed the scandal of enemy officer dining at their favorite establishments, but the basic fact remained that high-ranking prisoners had freedoms that seemed absurd given they had recently commanded armies trying to kill Americans. The special treatment justified by Geneva Convention provisions, but feeling wrong to people whose sons and husbands were fighting overseas in conditions far worse than Mississippi bungalows with gardens. The Geneva Convention's provisions about officer treatment created these contradictions. Designed by European military establishments in 1929 to ensure that captured aristocrats and professionals would not suffer indignities beneath their social station, the whole system assuming that war was conflict between governments rather than peoples. That officers on opposing sides had more in common with each other than with the enlisted men they commanded, that maintaining class distinctions even during war was essential to preserving civilization against the barbarism that total conflict threatened to unleash. American military authorities followed these rules carefully, despite public anger, about coddling enemy leaders. The government worried that mistreating German officers would lead to reciprocal abuse of American prisoners in German camps, the mutual hostage situation enforcing civility even during total war that killed millions and destroyed entire cities. Thomas Baker's father wrote home in September 1943, describing the strange contrast between his duties guarding generals and news from the Pacific, where Japanese treated American prisoners with systematic brutality that violated every provision of Geneva Convention. The different standards applied to different enemies, revealing how racism and cultural attitudes shaped supposedly universal rules of war. German generals received bungalows and gardens and trips to town. Japanese soldiers, when captured, faced harsh conditions and suspicion based on propaganda portraying them as subhuman fanatics rather than soldiers deserving respect. The disparity explained by Americans seeing Europeans as civilized opponents worthy of honor, while viewing Pacific enemies as barbaric savages deserving no quarter. The racial dimension of Geneva Convention enforcement, rarely acknowledged officially, but obvious to anyone paying attention to how prisoners of different nationalities were treated by American military authorities. The 3 admirals at Camp Shelby were naval officers captured during Mediterranean operations after Allied air and sea power made Axis naval operations suicidal. Men who had commanded U-boats and surface raiders before losing the Battle of the Atlantic to superior Allied resources and technology. Their presence in Mississippi, landlocked state, far from any ocean, adding to the surreal quality of the whole arrangement. One admiral spent his days writing memoirs about naval campaigns he had commanded. Another studied English with the goal of reading American naval history in original language so he could understand how his enemies had defeated him so thoroughly. The third focused on gardening with intensity that suggested he was trying to forget the ships he had lost and men who had died under his command, the therapeutic value of tending flowers in Mississippi heat, giving him purpose when broader military purpose had been stripped away by defeat and capture. The regular German prisoners at Camp Shelby, enlisted men and junior officers from the Afrika Korps, lived in standard barracks behind barbed wire with watchtowers and searchlights. Their conditions comfortable by POW standards, with adequate food and medical care and recreational opportunities, but nothing like the luxury afforded generals who lived in separate compound away from common soldiers. The class divisions that had defined German military for centuries persisted into captivity and created resentment among common soldiers who saw their commanders enjoying privileges while they remained confined to compounds, worked on labor details, cutting timber and clearing brush. The disparity making clear that military rank determined everything about prisoner experience, regardless of individual behavior or beliefs about Nazi ideology. Some enlisted prisoners worked on forestry projects in surrounding pinelands. Others helped construct Lake Shelby, a recreational facility that would serve the camp for decades after the war. Their labor paying 80 cents per day in canteen scrip according to Geneva rules, while generals strolled their gardens and debated military history without being required to perform any work at all. The contrast was stark enough that even guards noticed the unfairness, but regulations were clear that officers could not be compelled to labor, while enlisted men could be assigned tasks not directly related to war effort. The distinction based on centuries of military tradition about what was appropriate for different ranks, rather than any practical consideration about who should contribute to their own upkeep. Then something happened that revealed just how disconnected the generals were from the reality facing Germany, and how their captivity had become a strange, privileged bubble insulated from the brutal truths that regular soldiers confronted daily. In June 1944, news reached Camp Shelby about D-Day invasion. The massive Allied landing in Normandy that every prisoner knew would determine the war's outcome, regular soldiers understanding that Germany faced inevitable defeat, while generals in their bungalows discussed how the Wehrmacht might still achieve strategic stalemate through brilliant defensive operations, their professional military training making it psychologically impossible to accept that their nation had lost despite overwhelming evidence supporting that conclusion about Germany's collapsing strategic position. Von Arnim held court among fellow generals in evening gatherings at his bungalow, analyzing Allied operations with the same intellectual rigor he had applied during active command, pointing out tactical mistakes and operational vulnerabilities as if he were still fighting, rather than a prisoner whose battles were finished and whose advice would never again influence military operations. Younger officers listened respectfully, maintaining the military hierarchy even in captivity, the dynamics of German military culture so ingrained that defeat and imprisonment did not fundamentally alter relationships between ranks. Generals remained generals entitled to deference, and lieutenants remained subordinate, required to show respect regardless of all being powerless prisoners in a Mississippi camp thousands of miles from the war that had consumed their nation. The surreal quality of life reached peak absurdity when generals celebrated traditional German military holidays despite being enemy prisoners in America. The observances approved by American camp commanders because Geneva Convention protected cultural and religious practices as part of maintaining prisoner morale and dignity. On Kaiser Wilhelm's birthday and other ceremonial occasions, the generals gathered in dress uniforms they had been allowed to keep, toasted with wine that camp canteens sold them using their wages from the few who chose to work, sang military songs that celebrated German military heritage while carefully avoiding specifically Nazi content that might offend American sensibilities or violate regulations against political activities. The whole performance like elaborate theater where everyone played assigned roles without acknowledging the fundamental absurdity of defeated enemies celebrating military traditions that had led their nation to catastrophic defeat. Local Mississippi residents had mixed reactions to enemy generals living among them in relative luxury, while American boys died overseas, fighting the armies these same officers had commanded months or years earlier. Some were angry about the special treatment, wrote letters to congressmen complaining that prisoners lived better than many American civilians dealing with rationing and shortages, demanded explanations for why tax dollars fed and housed men who had tried to destroy America. Others were fascinated by proximity to men who had commanded famous military operations, saw the generals as living history worth studying and preserving. A few developing strange friendships with prisoners they encountered at restaurants or shops, when guards allowed supervised visits to town under provisions allowing officers freedom of movement within designated areas. An elderly woman named Margaret Foster, who ran a bookstore in Hattiesburg, remembered selling books to German generals throughout 1944 and 1945. Discussing literature with enemy officers who had read Goethe and Schiller and Thomas Mann, and shared her love of German Romanticism, the conversations creating cognitive dissonance between her hatred of Nazis and her genuine liking for cultured individuals who happened to be on wrong side of terrible war. Margaret said years later that one general whose name she never learned told her that being captured was relief because it meant he no longer had to kill people for regime he despised. That many Wehrmacht officers fought from duty and honor rather than belief in Nazi ideology. That Hitler and his party had corrupted German military traditions and turned honorable institution into tool of criminal enterprise that had brought shame to their nation. She did not know whether to believe him, whether this was honest confession or self-serving justification designed to win sympathy from naive American woman. But she found herself wanting to believe that not all Germans embraced Hitler, despite evidence that most had supported him enthusiastically until defeat became undeniable and the costs of their loyalty became impossible to ignore. The general spoke eloquently about difference between serving Germany and serving Nazis, insisted that true soldiers fought for nation rather than party. But Margaret wondered whether that distinction meant anything when the practical result was the same armies conquering countries and killing millions, regardless of what individual officers believed in their hearts about Hitler's ideology. The separation between generals in their bungalows and enlisted prisoners in barracks created two distinct POW experiences at Camp Shelby. The officers isolated from the Nazi intimidation and violence that plagued camps, where hardcore believers terrorized fellow prisoners who questioned loyalty to the Führer. The class privilege that had defined their military careers protecting them, even in captivity from the ideological conflicts tearing apart common soldier populations, enlisted men at Camp Shelby dealing with internal power struggles between Nazis and anti-Nazis. Secret courts and intimidation tactics meant to enforce conformity, while generals debated military theory and tended gardens in peaceful compound, where American guards prevented any harassment that might disturb the comfortable routine that Geneva Convention entitled them to enjoy. Thomas Baker's father wrote that guarding generals was easier than guarding regular prisoners because the officers policed themselves through internalized discipline and sense of military honor developed over decades of professional service. Rarely caused trouble or attempted escape because such behavior would be beneath their dignity as high-ranking soldiers who saw themselves as gentlemen first and warriors second. Their cooperation with American authorities was based not on accepting defeat or embracing Allied cause, but on maintaining standards of conduct they believed transcended individual wars. The professional military ethos that valued proper behavior and mutual respect between officers, regardless of temporary alignments that politics and war created between nations. The self-regulation made American commanders' jobs simpler and created atmosphere of mutual courtesy between captors and captives. But it also meant that generals existed in bubble protected from the moral reckonings that some common soldiers experienced when confronted with evidence of Nazi crimes their service had enabled. The privilege of rank meant they could avoid looking too closely at what their armies had done, could maintain comfortable fiction that they had fought honorably for their country, without examining whether that honor was compatible with serving regime that committed genocide and launched wars of aggression that killed tens of millions. Then something unexpected happened in spring 1945 that shattered the comfortable isolation the generals had maintained in their Mississippi bungalows for nearly 2 years. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, the news reaching Camp Shelby through official channels and underground radio that prisoners had built secretly despite regulations against such devices. The final collapse of the Third Reich, meaning that captivity was no longer temporary inconvenience before returning to military careers, but permanent reality, requiring fundamental psychological adjustment to world where German military no longer existed as independent institution and their professional identities had been rendered obsolete by total defeat. For generals whose entire adult lives, since their teenage years in cadet schools, had been dedicated to military service and advancement through ranks. Surrender meant not just Germany's defeat, but the end of the world they had known and the values that had structured their existence for decades. Von Arnim received the news in his bungalow, reportedly sitting in silence for 3 hours while processing implications of unconditional surrender and what it meant for his future. Emerging eventually to tell fellow generals that their duty now was to survive with honor and return to Germany to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. The quick pivot from resistance to acceptance, showing the pragmatic flexibility and adaptability that had made him successful commander, capable of adjusting to changing circumstances, even when those changes meant acknowledging complete failure of everything he had fought for. Other generals struggled more with the transition from military professionals to defeated enemies whose expertise and experience were suddenly worthless in world moving past total war into occupation and reconstruction. Some refused to believe the surrender was genuine and unconditional, convinced that Donit's government must have negotiated terms that preserved some German sovereignty and military structure. Others fell into depression when they understood that everything they had fought for was lost, and their nation divided between occupying powers who would reshape it according to Allied preferences. A few maintained defiant loyalty to Nazi ideology, even as evidence of concentration camps and systematic atrocities made such loyalty indefensible morally to anyone with conscience or human decency. American authorities ordered mandatory film screenings showing concentration camp footage for all prisoners, including generals, forcing every officer to watch documentation of Holocaust and Nazi crimes against humanity. The reaction among high-ranking military men, revealing the spectrum of knowledge and complicity that had existed within Wehrmacht leadership during the war. Some generals claimed they had no idea about systematic murder of Jews and other victims, expressed horror and disbelief at seeing the evidence of industrial-scale genocide, maintained that such crimes were unimaginable to professional soldiers who believed in honor and rules of war. Others admitted they had heard rumors about mass killings, but chose not to investigate or act because it was not their responsibility. Their moral cowardice, revealed by choosing military duty and willful ignorance over human decency and courage to confront evil within their own government. Still others maintained that such matters were SS responsibility rather than Wehrmacht concern, as if that distinction absolved them of guilt for serving regime that committed genocide and launching wars of aggression that enabled those crimes even if army officers did not personally pull triggers in death camps. The attempt to separate regular military from Nazi atrocities ignored reality that Wehrmacht had been essential to Hitler's conquests and had participated in war crimes across occupied territories. That the myth of clean Wehrmacht that many officers tried to promote was fiction designed to preserve their honor and avoid accountability for supporting criminal regime through their professional military service. One admiral who watched the films reportedly wept openly throughout the screening, told American officers afterward that he had fought honorably for his country without understanding the evil his service supported. That learning the truth destroyed any pride he might have felt in his naval career and decorations he had earned. Whether his distress was genuine recognition of moral failure or calculated performance designed to curry favor with captors was impossible to determine decades later. But his visible anguish represented broader crisis among German officers who had to reconcile their professional military identity with the monstrous regime they had served, and the question of whether following orders was sufficient defense when the orders came from government that committed crimes against humanity on unprecedented scale. The comfortable routine of gardens and books and gentlemen's agreements about conduct fell apart after the surrender, as prisoners confronted uncertain futures and destroyed nation and divided into those who accepted Germany's guilt versus those who maintained that they had simply followed orders in a war their nation happened to lose through superior Allied resources rather than moral failure of their cause. The divisions that had been papered over by shared military culture and focus on professional concerns rather than political ideology became open conflicts as some generals spoke about moral responsibility and need to acknowledge crimes committed in Germany's name, while others insisted that soldiers were not accountable for political decisions made by civilian leadership they had sworn to serve. Repatriation plans announced in June 1945 specified that officers would be among the first sent home because Geneva Convention prohibited forcing them to work, and continuing to house them served no practical purpose. But the devastation of Germany meant that returning was not the homecoming most had imagined during their comfortable captivity in Mississippi. Cities destroyed by bombing campaigns that had reduced major urban centers to rubble. Economy collapsed without functioning currency or industrial base. Families dead or displaced by war that had consumed their nation. The country divided into occupation zones controlled by powers that had defeated them, and now would reshape Germany according to Allied preferences about how to prevent future wars. Some generals learned through Red Cross channels that their homes had been obliterated in bombing raids or artillery barrages during final battles. Their families missing or killed in the chaos of defeat. The personal losses compounding the national catastrophe and making the question of where they would return to difficult to answer when the places they had left no longer existed. Others discovered their families had fled Soviet advance and were living as refugees in Western zones, dependent on Allied charity for survival, the reversal of fortune reducing proud Prussian families to desperate displaced persons begging for food and shelter. Thomas Baker's father volunteered to escort a group of generals, including von Arnim, to the East Coast for processing and repatriation in early 1946. The 3-day train journey north, giving him extended time with prisoners he had guarded for over 2 years. Conversations during the trip revealing the humanity beneath military ranks and enemy status, showing that these were men with families and hopes and fears rather than just symbols of defeated enemy that propaganda had portrayed. He wrote that von Arnim spoke movingly about his children, wondered what kind of Germany they would inherit from the ruins of the Third Reich, worried that American and Soviet occupation would turn his nation into permanent dependency rather than allowing Germans to determine their own future. The concerns of defeated generals sounding very similar to those of victorious allies trying to figure out how to manage post-war Europe without creating conditions for future conflict. The escort duty ended at a processing center in New Jersey, where generals were fingerprinted and documented and had their personal effects searched before boarding ships to Europe. The stripped-down bureaucratic procedure making brutally clear that their military rank meant nothing anymore in eyes of victorious powers. They were simply defeated soldiers going home to face consequences of losing a war their nation had started through unprovoked aggression against neighboring countries. Von Arnim shook hands with Thomas Baker's father before departing, thanked him for treating them with respect and dignity during captivity. Said that Americans had taught him that enemies could behave honorably toward each other even during total war, that the humane treatment he received in Mississippi had changed his understanding of what was possible between nations even when engaged in life-or-death struggle. The parting words suggesting genuine appreciation for treatment that had been far better than German generals had any right to expect, given what their armies had done across Europe. Thomas Baker discovered decades later that von Arnim lived until 1962, settled in Bad Wildungen in West Germany, and avoided public life almost completely, gave few interviews, and wrote no memoirs despite publishers offering contracts for his account of North African campaign and the surrender at Tunisia. His silence about his wartime service and time at Camp Shelby meant that the strange years in Mississippi remained largely undocumented from the general's perspective. Their experience of comfortable captivity, known mainly through American records and guard observations, rather than prisoners' own accounts of what they thought and felt during those surreal months tending gardens while their nation burned. The bungalows at Camp Shelby were torn down after the generals left in 1946, the gardens they had planted growing wild for one final season before being cleared to make room for other military uses as the camp transitioned from wartime training facility to peacetime reserve center. Regular training resumed on the grounds where enemy generals had lived in privilege, new soldiers preparing for service in Cold War conflicts against Soviet Union that had been wartime ally. The strange interlude of German officers in Mississippi becoming footnote in camp's history that was mentioned in museum displays but not emphasized because it raised uncomfortable questions about who deserved comfort during wartime and whether following international law meant enabling absurd inequalities. Margaret Foster, the bookstore owner who had sold books to German generals, said in an interview conducted in 1987 when she was 89 years old that she sometimes still wondered whether her conversations with enemy officers had been betrayal of American soldiers fighting overseas, whether she should have refused to treat defeated enemies with courtesy and kindness when their armies were killing American boys in Europe. But she concluded after decades of reflection that maintaining her own humanity required seeing prisoners as individuals rather than just representatives of evil regime. That choosing cruelty would have diminished her more than it punished them. That the capacity for compassion, even toward enemies, was what separated civilized people from barbarians, regardless of which side they fought for. The moral complexity of the situation, resisting simple judgments, even with benefit of 5 decades of hindsight and perspective. Thomas Baker organized a memorial service in 2018 at Camp Shelby, Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, honoring both guards and prisoners who had passed through during the war years. Invited families of former guards to share their fathers' and grandfathers' stories, and tried unsuccessfully to locate descendants of the German generals who had lived there in comfort and privilege while waiting out the war. The gathering brought together elderly veterans and middle-aged children of guards and young grandchildren who had never known the people whose service they were commemorating. 3 generations connected by strange history of enemy generals tending gardens in Mississippi while world burned around them. One veteran named Harold Simmons, who had been 19-year-old guard in 1944, spoke about watching von Arnim plant tomatoes and feeling angry that enemy general got to garden peacefully while his older brother was fighting in France. The resentment he felt about the unfairness of Geneva Convention that treated officers better than enlisted men regardless of which side they fought for. But he said that after 70 years, he had come to understand that the generals were just men caught in circumstances they did not fully control, that treating them humanely had been right choice even if it felt wrong at the time, that maintaining standards of civilization during war was what prevented total descent into barbarism that would have consumed everyone. An Austrian woman named Maria Ludwig, who had traveled from Vienna, stood up during the memorial service and complicated the comfortable narrative about American virtue and humane treatment. Told the story of her father Otto, who had been tortured by fellow Nazis in American POW camp, while generals lived in bungalows protected by their rank from the violence that endangered common prisoners. Her intervention reminding everyone present that the Mississippi camps had contained both best and worst of American POW system operating simultaneously. That the comfort afforded officers did not extend to enlisted men who needed protection just as much or more than generals who could take care of themselves through internalized discipline and military hierarchy. The memorial service concluded with recognition that Camp Shelby represented multiple truths that coexisted without contradiction. That generals had indeed lived comfortably in bungalows with gardens, and regular prisoners had suffered Nazi abuse in barracks. That Geneva Convention had succeeded in protecting some prisoners while failing others who fell between bureaucratic cracks. That American guards had tried to do right while working in a system that was fundamentally flawed by class assumptions embedded in international law. That the German prisoners had been both victims of ideology that destroyed their nation and participants in regime that committed atrocities across Europe. The moral complexity resisting neat summations about who deserved what treatment and whether justice had been served by following rules that created obvious inequalities. Thomas Baker died in 2021 at age 96, his children discovering among his papers extensive research files about the generals at Camp Shelby and what happened to them after repatriation. Evidence of decades-long effort to understand the strange episode his father had experienced as young guard watching enemy generals tend gardens while America fought total war against regime they represented. His daughter Sarah organized the research into a book manuscript that was published in 2023, bringing wider attention to the forgotten story of how Mississippi had hosted Hitler's generals in comfortable captivity that seemed absurd in retrospect, but had made perfect sense within the logic of Geneva Convention and international military law. The book sparked debate about whether the generals deserved the comfort they received, whether American taxpayers should have funded bungalows and gardens for enemy officers while American soldiers fought in hardship overseas. Whether following international law was moral imperative that transcended wartime emotions or practical calculation to protect American POWs through reciprocal treatment. The debate revealed continuing disagreement about the proper balance between justice and humanity, between following rules and achieving fairness, between treating enemies with dignity and holding them accountable for crimes their service enabled, even if they did not personally commit atrocities. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. Sarah Baker concluded the book by acknowledging that her grandfather had been right to treat the generals with respect, because all human beings deserved humane treatment regardless of what they had done. But also that the bungalows and special privileges had been wrong because they perpetuated unjust hierarchies that valued some lives more than others based on military rank rather than individual character or behavior. She wrote that the contradictions could not be resolved through better policy or clearer rules, but were inherent in trying to maintain civilization during wars that were fundamentally barbaric. That the generals' gardens blooming in Mississippi soil represented both the best impulses of humanity to preserve dignity, even for enemies, and the worst inequalities of systems that rewarded privilege while abandoning the vulnerable. That is what Camp Shelby teaches about war and captivity and the strange spaces where military honor meets human frailty, where international law creates privileges that seem obscene until you remember that the alternative is treating everyone as less than human, which is worse, where defeated generals tended flower beds in Mississippi heat while their nation burned and regular soldiers suffered in barracks. The whole arrangement making perfect legal sense while feeling morally wrong to anyone who examined it closely. The complexity enduring across generations as reminder that justice and humanity do not always align neatly, and that following rules sometimes means accepting outcomes that feel unjust, even when they represent the best compromise civilization can achieve during the barbarism of total war.